Well, I'm delighted to be here today to talk about business perspectives, and particularly since, as has already been alluded to, I think there's still quite a big gap between the real excitement and interest in the rapid sort of scientific and intellectual and economic development of how we assess natural capital and how to actually get that into simple messages that businesses can act on in the boardroom. So I think what I'd like to do is focus on, as every other speaker has done, not quite the question that was set, but where is business on natural capital at the moment? I really want to say why I think now is actually the time for business to be acting, and there's some good evidence from leaders as to why that's happening, but also what the asks are of business that we need from the evidence community, if I can call us that, to enable better action. And I come at it really with two hats, one as chair of Aldersgate Group, hopefully already mentioned, thank you Simon, to many of you, as a sort of business-led, progressive business-led NGO, which is representative cross-society and particularly cross-economy. And our argument really is around why good environmental governance gives rise to economic and social advantage and competitiveness to the UK. But also from the relatively recent Ecosystem Markets Task Force, which looked into what near field business opportunities were, and they were quite substantial, and on some of them we've had some government action and others we haven't. So firstly, if we look at why this decade is right for business action, I want to give just a personal perspective, having had 30 years working in environmental field, so a bit tongue-in-cheek this, but I would say the 80s, the knowledge base, where was the evidence base around natural capital, which although it had been invented, as we heard earlier, wasn't really used in anyone's language. It all actually lied very much on ecologists. It was sat within organisations like the Wildlife Trusts and the like, where real experts on their local patches knew far more than collective society did, but it wasn't really developed to the degree that it needed to be. I think the 90s we saw a fantastic growth, particularly in the education sector, of producing environmental scientists in response to 92 Rio, and the academic community really grew very substantially, and we saw the first integration of all the different disciplines that we've been hearing about, which are necessary to understand natural capital. The next decade, in my view, was the decade of environmental economics. So really didn't hear a lot about environmental economics until the millennium. And the environmental economists have been particularly powerful in introducing a lot of these concepts into policy, and we've got a lot of policy activity during that time. We've seen some of them already. Now, in this decade, I say this is a decade we really need to use all of that to display some environmental wisdom, because the fact of the matter is, while all of that activity was happening, we were continuing to erode our natural capital at quite a frightening rate, and we weren't really managing it very well. And from a business perspective, either use that available wisdom to act, or actually we're getting to the stage where we're seeing more and more evidence of how environment is actually harming business. So actually there's a really good business case to do something. But why now? Because the trouble with business is that long-term threats aren't really front of mind in terms of designing competitive advantage for your business. So first of all, let's have a look at these. Let's have a look at these with some P's. Firstly, at the planetary level, everyone here knows that we're well past the point of sustainable living on the planet. So we're into massive deficit at the moment. And whether you look at the World Wildlife Fund's ecological footprint work, whether you look at the UK, whether you look at what came out on Sunday with the synthesis report from the Climate Change UN IPCC, which really was arguing an impossible scenario, in my view now, of actually cutting fossil fuels to the degree required to keep within the 2 degree, inverted commas, safe limit, the sort of 50-50 point of not having significant damaging climate change. Actually, if you look at the trajectory, we're probably heading more like 6 degrees. All of that stuff actually washes over to a degree from a business point of view. More what has actually happened is the shock on labour and resources, which has arrived already. The continued rule that went on for a century and beyond, that year on year you could find cheaper labour by extending your global supply chains. Year on year you were discovering new resources in remote corners of the planet which kept resource prices dropping. Ended around 10, 15 years ago. And whilst there's a lot of volatility in this, which McKinsey produced this graph sort of managed to sort of write over quite well, underneath this, if you look at the data, there is no doubt about it that those are the kind of indicators which are a consequence of this pressure on our natural capital. And those are affecting business decisions now. What makes sense about where you place your supply chain, what makes sense about how you source your raw materials is really changing. In terms of policies, we've seen a lot of these from government, but I think it's worth saying that while the rhetoric has been relatively low, there has been a lot of action in the underlying architecture. And we've heard about a lot of these already: the Natural Environment White Paper, the National Ecosystems Assessment, National Climate Adaptation Plan, Natural Capital Committee, Ecosystem Markets Task Force, and I want to come back and talk a bit about payments for ecosystem services as well. You know, this is classic UK stuff. We are world leaders. We heard we're world leaders in environmental science. We're also world leaders in writing policy. What we're not world leaders at is actually delivering action. And what I'm here today to talk about is what business needs to be able to take action. And that has been mirrored. There's been business activity. We've got the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity, TEEB. The TEEB initiatives produce some really good material. Obviously, the Natural Capital Initiative here. And I think there's a real appetite in the next government to get some new legislation. So I think the policy environment's actually pretty good. And the next thing is people. The business community is dependent on leadership, and leadership comes often at an individual level. The difference between a good business and an excellent business is often the quality of the leadership. And we do have business leaders like Ian Cheshire and Paul Polman who have stood up and talked a lot about this subject and really get it. We also have an increasing minority of investors who are really interested in defining what a green bond is, what actually climate bonds are, how to invest in a way which is actually going to enhance natural capital as well as deliver all the conventional metrics that they look at. We've got our Green Investment Bank, again another world first here in the UK, which was something that the Aldersgate was very involved in its inception. And we believe that actually the next government we should be able to see something at a personal level, green ISAs being introduced. There are new alliances also forming. I want to just highlight one that may not be so familiar on this side of the pond, which is Mark Turcott's book with Andrew Liveris. Mark's a Goldman Sachs banker through and through who has taken over the Nature Conservancy Council. And this book, sort of published by the Harvard Business School, I think is the first time the Harvard Business School has actually written something that is strongly articulating how investment in natural capital is essential for long-term business competitiveness and survival. And I think it's also a good lesson because it actually speaks well to the business community, explains all of this stuff, and it never uses the words ecosystem services, which still baffle the majority of business. We do need to work on language. But other issues in terms of what people are saying about healthcare and the affordability of NHS, about well-being being actually the important criteria. We need some kind of new natural capital committee that's reinvented and which actually has more longevity and more permanence in its role. The personal need for non-material wealth in a recession actually is a driver towards other values, and that includes the intrinsic values which nature brings. And we do see some increased consumer action too. And then perhaps most important of all in terms of the business world is managing risk. And nature and natural capital are now delivering us some pretty significant risks. So this is work done by the World Economic Global Risk Report. I'm looking particularly at a period sort of 5 to 3 years ago because actually this is when we got the data and this is when it really changed because of world events. And these were the conventional plots of what you would see if you pick the top 10 risks for global businesses. And if you looked at natural capital risks in 2009, they were generally pretty bottom quartile and therefore not really giving attention. Asking exactly the same questions as the World Economic Forum did amongst around 100 leading global businesses. In 2011, they'd moved to there because they'd been impacted directly in their supply chains. We'd had here in the UK, we'd actually lost 3 months production in Honda, for example, because of flooding in Thailand, so that they couldn't get one particular widget needed, and therefore the whole thing collapsed. This has led to a really significant change in terms of where risk management and therefore where board time is going. So all in all, we've got a very good position setting ourselves up. The business is ready and is listening, but it's got some key asks. And one of the reasons that Aldersgate Group got very involved in terms of this, and this was work led by Ian Dickey of FTech, who's our leading director in this area, was to actually bring out for the business communities in simple languages, in simple messages and language, the requirements that business needed to be able to act. So it got the message that this is something it would like to make a contribution to. And those 5 things still stand. So although this was actually published a while ago, actually all of these things were only at the baby step side of solving. So the first is the general message about economic success depending on a healthy environment, and the fact that biodiversity and ecosystem services and the natural capital are as much part of that as the more conventional pollution-related environmental issues. The second is this importance of pricing, what so many call what's priceless. You know, the value of biodiversity, ecosystem services, of natural capital has to be reflected in prices and policy appraisal, and let's face it, we are still a long way off doing that. And one of the excuses for that is the complexity, and we have to break through that complexity and live with the 80-20 rule while continuing to do the good science, produce the evidence and do all the other good work that's needed to actually make sure that we hone this over time. Company decisions and national accounts can't come to the right conclusions until that valuation takes place. And it also means that we're not reducing all the aspects of natural capital purely to a monetised basis. It doesn't deny the intrinsic and social and health and all of the other issues that we believe will come in. I think the irony is all of those things just really emphasise the importance of taking this into account. At the moment, if we could just take the monetary side, we would see much better decisions. There's also the issue of the inelastic nature of some of the systems within natural systems that we're dependent on. And it's very important that that asymmetric elasticity is understood by business and that we stay away from those critical limits, but also we also need to look at critical trends, ones where there's an acceleration over time that we can't afford to be at the top, if you like, of the slippery slope. And a resource-efficient economic model is a massive way of reducing the risk to those, both of those that we know about now and those that I fear we don't know enough about. Regulation is the fourth one. Really difficult message with the current government, but one we must continue to battle on. Business can't function in terms of these emerging and externalities on the markets without smart regulation. It does create new business opportunities and it does create new markets, and those are real opportunities for the UK. But if we can't get business and government working together to engage the consumer, build trust, change behaviour, and where necessary regulate to show the courage of convictions, I'm afraid it's going to be very difficult to do purely on a voluntary basis. And lastly, business is willing to take the lead. Aldersgate's got some fantastic members who are doing tremendous stuff. They are willing to stick their head above the parapet, but they are dependent on being seen to be leaders and actually see the underpinning work. So as this rises up the political and consumer agenda, they see followers taking on. Then the other area I want to look at is, well, what are these markets? And they're quite significant. The MTF identified over $1 billion of UK latent market right now, here. And unfortunately, the government's only chosen really to stimulate about 1/5 of that so far. I really don't understand why it has such difficulty, other than this issue that it says, oh, there's a bit of uncertainty, a bit of argument amongst the scientific community. We don't know whether it's exactly, 2.3 or 2.4, so we'll do nothing. When actually, if it's between 2.3 or 2.4, we should do something. And that, I think, is something that we all have got a responsibility to continue to make clear, that scientific uncertainty does not equal an excuse for procrastination. Biodiversity offsetting actually was the biggest one. If we look at the Natural Capital Committee, what it's telling us is we have got this massive deficit and we are continuing to erode it. We want to turn that around. The sooner we can turn the supertanker around. What business said is, actually, if you give us a clear ask that all development delivers no net loss or net gain, where there are mechanisms, market mechanisms to deliver that. And where these are used, for example, in wetlands in the States, actually it's a pretty efficient market. There's a lot that could be done in the farming community, and bioenergy and anaerobic digestion is one thing that's had support, basically looking at the nutrient cycle within farms and on farms, and actually recovering all the benefit of that instead of releasing it into the environment where we get all of this damage down the catchments. Looking also at wood fuel, we saw the diagram there showing the benefits of actually some reforestation in the UK. There's also an enormous majority of woodland which is not managed and which is not actually reaching its full ecosystem, biodiversity and economic potential. Nature-based certification and labelling. We've got to reach consumers with simple messages about how their decisions at the purchasing point have impacts on natural capital. Collectively, they're huge. And water cycle is perhaps the biggest of all. We heard earlier about the difficulty in persuading the specifiers to get off their concrete fix. Engineers are beginning to understand how they can work within natural systems, but at the end of the day, most of the models used within the quantity surveyors and the specifiers actually don't have the right figures to come to the right conclusion. So there's a whole variety of stuff around that. And just on water cycles, I think it's worth just coming back for a close to talk about payment for ecosystem services. Again, something else, we've actually done some really good work in the UK. And this is DEFRA's report on best practice guide, showing how actually you can derive these projects which work, across the relatively complicated cross-sector agreements that are required. Many of these actually legally quite difficult to handle because they're relatively untried and untested. There's a huge difficulty in getting these going. So, as with all new technology where you need support for demonstration projects, we need more support for the demonstration projects which actually can deliver these kind of integrated natural capital based solutions, because they do require quite a lot of innovation. But again, we've got some good policy underpinning it. So just to conclude, what am I saying? I'm saying firstly, there's a fantastic amount of expertise and readiness in the business community to contribute to what we need to achieve in natural capital. Businesses manage at their heart value. And they do that from the capital they deploy, from the revenues and the profits they make from them, and from intangibles. Businesses are also very good at understanding intrinsic value and how brand and reputation are really important. Things that are very important in terms of the value of our natural capital. The second point is, if we look at the urgency of this, we need to get a dialogue going which is talking about our natural capital debt, which is absolutely massive. If you compare it with our delivery of revenues, our ecosystem services, you could argue that it's a tenfold bigger debt than we have in terms of our financial debt. And look at how the whole of society has been impacted by the government's predilection to deal with that. And if there's risk associated with our financial debt, there's certainly risk associated with our natural capital debt. Thirdly, businesses do have the tools to enhance natural capital. They do have the tools to grow ecosystem services. They can make decisions now. Some of them are, many of them aren't. And they can also manage its intrinsic worth. Don't think that businesses don't get that. Businesses are in the community, they have employees, they know that they need to recruit, they have all sorts of issues around their productivity which are dependent on the health and well-being and the desirability of the location in which they carry out their business. All of these things link very strongly to the intrinsic worth of nature. But my final point is that business must have a clear ask on natural capital to be able to act. And at the moment that clarity isn't coming through. It's schizophrenic from government, on the one hand putting forward really good objectives, and on the other hand not underpinning that in decisions made, whether it be infrastructure decisions, investment decisions and policy decisions. Similarly, it must have a clear ask from society. And then lastly, and most relevant I think today, is it must have clarity of purpose from those providing the evidence. So you must be able to communicate and boil down our extensive knowledge within this area that's really developing at quite a rate into language that business can understand. Thank you very much indeed.